I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to talk to this CAIRIBU forum. I appreciate the invitation, and hopefully I can share some of our tips for successful resubmissions for grants. So let's get started. So who am I? You've heard a little bit about who I am. I'm a basic scientist, cell biologist and biochemist by training, and I have broad interests in tissue remodeling in the bladder primarily. So my experience, what gives me any right to talk in a forum such as this? Well, I've had many grant submissions over the last 15 to 20 years. Some were funded first time, that's extremely rare, or after a resubmission, some were never funded. And having said that, we've had 5 successful resubmissions from the group, both R01s and R21s. I've also sat on the other side of the fence, so not just a grant writer, but I'm also a grant reviewer for a number of organizations, including the NIH, the DoD, and the VA. And I had a short term as a chair of an NIDDK fellowship review panel. So I've heard comments about resubmissions in that forum as well. So take that as you may. This is my experience, and I'm going to tell you how we've gone about approaching resubmissions. So just since I know we probably have a mixed audience, I wanted to just give the typical grant submission and review timeline and some potential outcomes. So as you know, about 6 months prior to submitting a grant, you start to think about the grant application. There are various institutional deadlines where you have to submit the grant prior to the official deadline. And within the first month after submission, there's receipt, referral, and typically assignment to a study section. 3 to 4 months after that, there will be the so-called merit review. So as we hear as grant reviewers, study sections do not fund grants. They simply judge the merit of the science. And essentially there are 2 outcomes from a study section review. The grant is either not discussed, also known as streamlined, triaged, or unscored, or it is discussed and will therefore receive a impact score. Occasionally, a grant that is in the supposed to be not discussed pile will be rescued and will also undergo some discussion at the study section. And then there are a number of potential outcomes. The first is that you get a fundable score. And if that's the case, the application will move forward to council review, and that's typically about 3 months after the study section meeting. And if all goes well, this is typically for grants that hit the pay line, are in line with the mission of the institute that's going to fund the application, your grant will be funded. However, there are occasions where even if the grant moves forward to council review, depending on budgets and other factors, the grant may not be funded, even if it scored quite well. And then the other outcomes would be the not discussed grants. Those are not going to be funded in that particular round, and the grants that are discussed but do not receive fundable scores. So for these not funded applications, the next step is to revise and resubmit, and you return to the beginning of this timeline. So that's just for people who may not have gone through much of this experience, just so that we're all on the same page. So we've talked about some of the grant outcomes, and let's consider the next steps. So if your grant is unscored, commiserations. It's happened to pretty much every investigator that has ever submitted a grant for consideration. If your grant is scored, I would say congratulations. This in and of itself is an achievement. It means your grant will be discussed by the panel, and you'll get some additional review comments on top of the individual criterion score reviews. If your score is in the fundable range, even better. Huge congratulations. That is cause for celebration. However, the reality is, given the pay lines, that only a fraction of grants reviewed in any given study section will ultimately move to funding. And so resubmission of grants that, even if they scored relatively well, it's going to be a common occurrence in your career if you stay in academics. One little bit of personal advice: I always check the score and the summary statement simultaneously. I want all the pain in one go. I don't want to get a score and not really know what it means. And so if you can stand to wait until your summary statement becomes available, I would strongly recommend that. And then at least you get an instant interpretation of what the score actually means. So given this scenario, if your grant has been unscored or is actually beyond the fundable range, you have to come up with a strategy to deal with that. So the first step is to read the comments and then put the summary statement away for at least a week. Nothing is going to change in that intervening week in terms of your timing. Typically, you're going to reapply for the grant at the next deadline, and that's going to be a number of weeks away, if not months away. And so I think it's really important to process the comments at an emotional level. All of us have experienced disappointment, frustration, anger, even disbelief at some of the feedback that we've received. And those are all completely normal initial reactions. So this is not really a place for the stiff upper lip. I think just be annoyed and use that annoyance and frustration to fuel your resubmission. So as I say, just let those emotions play out and then come back to the application itself and the comments with a clear head to address the following question. What is the fastest route to funding? And so that's really where you want your attention to be. Should you revise and resubmit based on the nature of the comments? Or realistically, are you going to have a better chance if you go back to the drawing board and submit a new proposal? And the decision between those two potential paths of action is really a judgment call, and it's one that you should not make in isolation. So in terms of next steps, it's important to read and reread the summary statement several times, because you'll miss information the first time, particularly if you're feeling a little frustrated by the feedback. So it's important that you get every last item out of the summary statement. One practical suggestion is to make a grid of the overall and the criterion scores for each of the reviewers. And then you can see the patterns that drop out in terms of where reviewers were enthusiastic or not. Then compile a list of what are deemed to be the score driving weaknesses by scored criterion. You can then divide those weaknesses into those that are major, moderate, or minor, and hopefully good reviewers will specify their level of concern about a specific weakness. And reviewers are encouraged to do this in their written critiques. It's really important to share the summary statement with not only the other members of your grant application team, your co-investigators, but also mentors and other trusted colleagues. It's certainly a scenario where you have to put your ego aside, because again, your team and your mentors in particular will have experienced exactly the same emotions that you yourself are experiencing, and they can often provide really valuable and objective feedback. And then it's a process of brainstorming and mapping out if and how each weakness could be addressed in a tangible, concrete fashion. And so this is going to be an iterative process, and you can decide how you plot your path forward. Once you have a general sense of the potential outcomes here, if you're going to revise and resubmit or submit a new proposal, it's at this point, once you've done your homework, essentially, that it's wise to contact your program officer. So the program officer is listed typically the top left-hand corner of a summary statement, certainly from the NIH. And if the grant has been discussed but did not hit the pay line, the program officer may be able to share some general sentiments and feedback from the study section review meeting, because they will often participate in those meetings. At least they'll be in the room and they may hear elements of the discussion. If the grant is unscored, because of their experience, program officers can often help decide whether you should be submitting a new proposal. They can often help you read between the lines. So very often reviewers will not necessarily give you explicit feedback, but based on the type of language that they're using, you can get a sense of where their enthusiasm lies. And the program officers are often very valuable allies in this process. So helping you understand what did they really mean when they give you a specific comment. Based on this discussion, then you can decide if a resubmission is actually worthwhile. And again, this is a little bit of a judgment call based on the nature of the comments. And we'll go through some examples in a couple of slides. You have to be able to determine what can be addressed easily versus things that really, it's going to be much harder to address. So if those key issues are easily addressable, then I would likely plan a resubmission. If the key issues are not easily fixed, then I think you're in a situation of planning a new grant. And many of you are probably familiar with some of the resources available through the NIH. The NIAID has put together a tremendous set of resources for all things grant related. And the URL here on this slide, if you go to that, this will lay out much of the same kind of information, sort of how you move through this decision tree of what to do when your grant is unscored or not funded. So at this point, it's probably worth just reflecting on the top reasons why grants are not funded. And this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but it's some of the things that I have experienced as a grant writer, where we've been criticized. Also, some of the issues that I've observed frequently as a grant reviewer. I've color-coded these to give some sense of whether they are addressable or not easily. So the first big issue is significance. So if you are getting feedback that the problem or the question is not important, that's a pretty serious consideration, and it probably suggests that you need to go back to the drawing board and re-envision the grant and the proposal. Hopefully there'll be additional feedback that will allow you to redesign the grant to increase the significance of the question. Investigators. So very often there's a criticism that the team does not possess the relevant expertise. So that is fixable. And we'll go through some of the solutions in a few slides. Innovation, the solution to the problem is not novel. That is potentially fixable. And but again, the devil's in the details of how you go about this. In terms of approach, the implementation is lacking or inappropriate. That is also fixable. Perhaps your approach is underdeveloped. Maybe it's overambitious. You have no contingency plans. Those are all fixable problems. In terms of the environment, if there's a perception that there are insufficient resources available to you to execute the project, again, potentially fixable, but that could be challenging. depending on your institutional environment. Very occasionally, grants will not be selected for funding because they're not really in line with the funding agency mission. This is rare with the NIH because of the availability of parent announcements where you submit your best science. Probably more likely to occur with, for example, foundation grant applications where the mission of the foundation is very specific and you don't really meet their mission. And potentially some of the other funding agencies such as the DoD, which have specific research programs that one would apply to, their instructions are very clear about what is and is not appropriate. And so hopefully this is not a criticism that you receive, but certainly this is something that should be dealt with upfront. Make sure that you are responding to the mission of the funding agency. It's possible that your proposal was not reviewed in the correct study section. Again, this is a rare issue. It can happen. The Office of Receipt and Referral at NIH has tremendous expertise, and they very rarely would assign a grant to a study section that does not have the expertise to review it. You will see your assignment to the study section, and if you have concerns about that, this is before the grant is reviewed. If you have concerns, you can contact the NIH to address that. Again, this would be before the grant is reviewed, but obviously is fixable in a resubmission. A very easy problem to fix that's often an issue with grants is that the application was poorly written and or presented. And so that is a grantsmanship issue. There's really no solution other than to write the grant better. And I know through CAIRIBU, there are many resources to assist with this. Specific to career development awards, one thing that I have seen frequently is a criticism that career development plans are underdeveloped. And we'll touch on that in a little bit later in the presentation. And then the most likely outcome, which is potentially fixable, is that the application scored well but did not reach the pay line. And this is somewhat beyond our control in any given submission cycle. As many of you know, at least for the NIH, pay lines range from the 9th to the roughly the 18th percentile for R01s, or impact scores of between 20 and about 32 for K awards and R21s. And so it's simple arithmetic that a large fraction of grants that do pretty well are not going to hit the pay line and therefore will have to come back for resubmission. The reason they didn't reach the pay line is probably a summary of many of the things that I've just described. And so hopefully those are fixable. So the reality, which we're talking about today, is that most grants are not funded in any given cycle. And so here we are with the issue of resubmission. So how do we fix these problems? So I would argue that significance is hard to fix without really a substantial overhaul of the proposal. And this is where you really need your colleagues. You need people who will tell you honestly if they don't think your idea is coalescing, if the disease that you're studying, maybe it's just not really a problem that needs to be addressed. And so that is typically a decision that you'll have to come to as a group with your team, the team that's putting together the proposal. And it's generally quite difficult to address this effectively without major changes to the grant and resubmission. And so as a result, I would strongly consider a new proposal if you're in this position. Investigators, if there are issues with investigators, these are potentially fixable. You can, if there's a insufficient personnel on the grant in terms of effort, then increase the personnel associated with the grant. If there is a lack of specific expertise, it's relatively straightforward to add collaborators or co-investigators with that expertise. And one criticism that I have received is relates to productivity. So publication, track record, make sure that you have appropriate productivity before you apply for a grant. And I say appropriate, this is going to differ depending on your career stage. Innovation, also potentially fixable. And what you really want to do is ensure your methodology is state-of-the-art, but importantly, it should be feasible. If things are so cutting edge that they haven't really been validated by the scientific community, then you may be highly innovative, but you may be criticized for lack of evidence that the approach is feasible. So I think innovation is always a balance between cutting edge and feasible. In terms of the approach, again, this is not an exhaustive list because there are many ways that approach can sink a grant. But make sure that the experiments you're actually proposing will test your hypothesis. This is, it's not uncommon that they actually don't test the hypothesis. Make sure your methodology is appropriate and feasible. One thing that can often kill grant applications is that the advances are going to be incremental. So you want to avoid that wherever possible. Ideally, and this is more relevant to those doing basic and translational research, ideally it should be mechanistic as opposed to descriptive science. You can demonstrate feasibility with inclusion of preliminary data. And one very powerful response to criticisms that arise in review is to add new preliminary data in direct response to a criticism. That not only demonstrates feasibility, but also conveys a sense of momentum that you've been working on this problem in the interim, and you're not going to be dissuaded from pursuing this line of investigation. Importantly, you should include a discussion of predicted outcomes, but also their implications. So as a grant reviewer, it's not uncommon to read that people just expect everything that they propose will work out exactly as they expect. And that's almost never the case in original research. And if you know what's going to happen before you do the experiment, then do you really need to do the experiment? So I think it's really important to address the question, if this outcome is true, what does it imply? So go beyond a simple reporting of anticipated results, actually discuss the implications for the science. Another thing that is often omitted is an adequate discussion of potential pitfalls, limitations of techniques, and alternative approaches. So it's really important to include contingency plans for when things may not work as anticipated. And then if you are engaged in patient-focused research and you're proposing some kind of prospective analysis, ensure that your targets for patient accrual can actually be met. In terms of the environment, ensure that you're presenting your environment effectively. And so I would say go beyond the bricks and mortar. So what do I mean by that? I mean, it's not enough to simply say that you're at a great institution. So I'm fortunate to work at an institution that's affiliated with Harvard Medical School, which is a great place to be. There's an enormous research community here, but you can't just say, well, you know, I'm at Harvard Medical School and leave it at that. That's not really what reviewers are trying to assess. They want to know if your immediate environment is actually going to support the science that you do. And so you need to be specific about how your environment enriches the proposed work. again, if you are performing patient-focused research, how does your environment support that endeavor? So can you provide evidence that you see a certain number of patients with a given condition over a given period of time that will enable you to recruit for a clinical study, for example? Similarly, if you are using core facilities or you need certain cutting edge technology, you should advertise that you have that on your doorstep and that you have access to it. And so that's really what the environment means in this particular scenario. And then there are many issues around clarity and confusion about science. And so if you hear yourself saying, the reviewers totally missed the point of my grant, or the reviewers didn't get it as you review your summary statement, 9 times out of 10, that's actually on you as the grant writer. It's a communication issue. It's certainly the case that reviewers miss things in grants. And so part of the decision-making process when you revise and resubmit an application is, did you present it clearly enough? And so it's really critical that the key aspects of your ideas come through clearly. When you write your grant, you really have to write the grant as a reviewer. So you are anticipating and countering potential reviewer criticisms. It's important in the text of the grant that you justify essentially every claim that you make. If you mention that you're going to do immunohistochemical staining for a certain target, the expectation in the mind of the reviewer is that you are using validated antibodies. And if you can demonstrate that the antibody actually works, and you show appropriate controls that it works specifically, that's a very powerful argument that you're using authenticated reagents. You should treat your proposal as a one-sided debate with the reviewer. So I'm going to attribute this comment to John Way from the University of Michigan. I heard him talk about this at the AUA Office of Research Early Career Investigator Workshop one year. And this one comment I find extremely valuable. So you're effectively in a debate with the reviewer, but you're not there to explain things for them. So you cannot make claims and then not qualify and clarify them in the text. And then sort of correlated to this is that you need to help the reader understand your logic. So I think a lot of issues in resubmission have to do with clarifying. So be extremely clear about the proposed experiments, the types of analyses, the types of endpoints, and then how you're going to handle the outcomes. What will that mean to you in terms of testing your hypothesis and moving your field forward? I want to make just a couple of comments about Career Development Award proposals in particular. So I mentioned that the underdevelopment of a career development plan is a common criticism, and particularly in review of F31s, 32s, K awards. I've seen this particular criticism probably more than any other. And so for a Career Development Award proposal, there should be a clear discussion of the new skills that you're going to acquire over the course of your award duration. These can be practical skills. You're going to learn single-cell RNA sequencing. You may engage in workshops or nano courses in support of that. You may be taking formal coursework or engaging in a degree program, some kind of master's degree, an MPH, such as that. What's really important is that you want to convey a sense of how these activities are designed to advance your career. So there should be specificity to the career development plan. More often than not, you'll see people saying, well, I'll take a statistics course, I'll take a grant writing course and I'll do some other kind of generic career development or professional development activity. And that's really not going to go over well with reviewers. They want to know what are the things that you will do that will position you to then be an independent investigator at the conclusion of your grant award. That is the mission of a career development award proposal. And so there has to be specificity related to you yourself. And one way that's very effective to accomplish this is to actually define milestones for the specific accomplishments that you hope you will have at the end of your career development award period. So for the next few slides, I just wanted to share a couple of experiences that I have had, an R21 and an R01, both of which were revised and resubmitted. And hopefully this summarizes some of the comments that I've made earlier in the presentation. So this is an R21 award that was submitted back in 2010. And the original outcome of the review was a score of 27, and that was not in the fundable range. So, and actually, having gone back and looked at these scores, I'm not even sure this would be discussed in the current era, but be that as it may. So you can see wide range of opinions here, but this is the idea to put together this grid for the 5 scored criteria and the scores from each of the 3 reviewers. And so you can see 2 reviewers were relatively enthusiastic. One was really not at all enthusiastic. And that was reflected in the comments. Probably the 2 score driving criteria were significance and approach, and that's common for most applications, I would say. You don't need to read all of these details, certainly not now, but there were some comments about obviously the summary of discussion. There were strengths and weaknesses. I had a comment here about my publication record. This was interesting that there was a difference of opinion about high impact, high risk. So the risk reward ratio here is important. It's an R21 application. So this was the original outcome. As I think all of you know, there's an opportunity to respond to comments. So one puts together a 1-page introduction, essentially a rebuttal to the reviewer comments. This is an opportunity to thank the reviewers for their feedback. Again, this is volunteer activity to serve on a study section. You obviously can respond to key points. You can demonstrate momentum with new data, and you can clarify misunderstandings. And there was one big misunderstanding in this particular grant application that we were able to rectify. It's also an opportunity to educate and inform the non-assigned reviewers. So if they read that 1-page introduction and get a sense that you have been highly responsive, and that will sort of get the non-assigned reviewers on side, I would say. And I'll give an example of that. You have 1 page, and certainly when you get to an R01, this is pretty limited space. And so you really can only respond to the major issues that come up, and those are generally going to be the score driving issues. Minor issues can be addressed within the body of the grant. So if there are grantsmanship issues, you just write the grant better. Really, really importantly, you want to argue your case in the rebuttal. So you don't want to just cave to every criticism that is made of your science. You want to argue your case, but do it in a respectful way. Do not insult the reviewers, because chances are at least one of them is going to be re-reviewing the revised proposal. So there's a lot of text here. Again, I don't want to go through this in detail, but I do want to highlight a few elements of the introduction. So I will generally write a very brief summary of the outcome of the prior review. I typically include the score. Some people say you shouldn't. I don't think there's any prohibition to doing that, but I think it just gives, again, the non-assigned reviewers a little bit of context. You thank the reviewers for their positive comments and highlight some of the positives that were mentioned in the first round of review. So again, this is all about setting a scene. And then I will very often include a statement that we've added new data. So again, this is this momentum comment. So you want to convey to the new set of reviewers that you have kept going from the prior period of review, you've kept going on the project. And then since we're required to indicate changes in the revised application, you can state how you are doing that in the body of the grant. Next, I will divide the responses for each reviewer. So I will summarize all of the concerns of reviewer 1 and summarize those very briefly, paraphrasing, obviously, and then we'll summarize, in doing so, we'll summarize the score driving concerns. And then we go through each of the concerns in turn, and you can obviously number these depending on the extent of the comments. We had some criticisms in this particular application about whether we could actually do the work. You can see the response to critique 2, difficult to create. This is pure tool building. The PI has not been working in this area, no papers. So this was the negative reviewer. And so we pushed back a little bit on this first concern about effort, and we addressed the feasibility. The tool building comment was actually an opportunity for us because this was a grant submitted in response to a program announcement developing tools. And so we added there was a little bit of tang to this, I think, in the response, but it was essentially a clarification of a misunderstanding. We lifted language directly from the program announcement and slotted it into the introduction. So that's very powerful. And then we also added a comment that we had discussed this with an NIDDK program officer to clarify that tool building was not only okay, but it was actually the purpose of the program announcement. There was a concern about productivity. I indicated that there was a publication in the works, and we also addressed some issues about innovation. And then I mentioned this issue of informing the non-assigned reviewers. Our third reviewer was very generous with her comments, and so we popped in a little bit of a summary from that reviewer, that they had been generous and they said some nice things about us. So again, that just provides context to people who are going to be bringing your grant up in real time as the review discussion is proceeding. So the practical changes that we actually made in response to these comments, we had additional analysis included. This is essentially addressing a contingency, part of the contingency plan. We clarified a couple of key points that had been raised in review. We acknowledged limitations. Again, that was a clarification. We revised the scope of the project, and that spoke to feasibility of accomplishing the work in a 2-year period. We justified our focus on tool building as per the program announcement. And we pushed back a little bit on the comment about innovation. And really, we were coming at this from a new conceptual angle versus a technical angle. So this was the outcome of the revised proposal. So the score improved to a 20, and that put us within the fundable range. And so you can see a radically different set of scores, much higher enthusiasm. And again, those key criteria, significance and approach, improved very significantly in the revision. And then again, this point about tool building, you know, it ended up in the first sentence of the summary of discussion. And so we made that very effectively. And so that was one example from an R21. Again, this was now 14 years ago. And so the landscape may be a little bit different. And then I just want to finish with an R1 proposal. This was a bit of an odyssey. So I'm describing one of the original submissions and the resubmission. So this was an R01 that scored a 38, and so it was at the 28th percentile, so quite far beyond the pay line at the time. We actually had 4 reviewers in the original application, and again, you can see the score driving criteria are significance and approach. The typical layout of a summary of discussion, so a brief description of the project, the strengths, and yet there were a number of significant weaknesses, lack of mechanistic studies, lack of a well-defined model, so on and so forth. And this phrase at the end, these concerns dampened the reviewers' enthusiasm for the project. So in terms of this introduction, similarly, we stated what happened in the prior review, thanked the reviewers, highlighted the positives and described the inclusion of new data. And in this particular case, we had extensive new data. So to highlight in bold all of the figures where we had added data. We essentially overhauled this proposal. And so we clarified that there was no indication of changed text in the body of the grant. And that's an important thing to do, so the reviewers are not looking for something that does not exist. So again, we divided the responses by critique, reviewer, and addressed the key comments in order. So there were extensive comments here, and we had to be very selective about what we responded to. And that's going to require some time and thought about how you rank order all of these weaknesses. One of these comments, the lack of novelty about the traditional nature of the experimental approach, we pushed back on that and highlighted that the novelty is really in the concepts. Traditional methods, there's nothing wrong with using traditional methods because they are reliable and there's a high degree of confidence that you will get informative data. One other point, if you find that more than one reviewer is highlighting the same issue, then you can essentially collapse your response and just refer them back to the response to the first critique. And then importantly, state clearly if you have generated new resources. This was a criticism that we had experienced, and we actually generated a new strain of mice in response. So the practical changes, we really paid attention to the significance of this proposal. We added data from patients. We justified our animal model. We added fairly extensive new preliminary data. So the human patient data not only addressed the issue of significance, but also demonstrated momentum with the project. We had data from a new conditional mouse model, and we improved the feasibility. We removed material that was causing confusion, simply deleted those experiments, and then we addressed the concerns about innovation, both methodological and conceptual. So this was the revised outcome. And again, you can see it's sort of like night and day. Again, the score driving criteria of significance and approach were significantly improved. And the point that I would like to highlight in this summary of discussion, PI has responded comprehensively to the previous criticisms, and the proposal is strengthened. So I don't want anyone to think that I'm sitting here blowing my own trumpet, because this particular grant was a real odyssey. So from first submission to funding took 4 years. We had 4 submissions of the proposal, and we actually had 5 reviews. And just to give you a sense of how the percentile rankings changed over the 4 years, we started at the 17th percentile. So we were in spitting distance of getting this grant funded. And we responded to all of the comments in that first review, and we ended up at the 37th percentile. And this sort of illustrates one of the take-home points for today I'll touch on in a moment. Because of that critique, we were so disbelieving of the critique that we actually appealed. And people tell you, don't ever appeal the outcome of a grant review. We did. And this was, I suppose, a matter of principle. And graciously, the NIDDK or CSR actually agreed to re-review it in a different panel. But it ended up at the 27th percentile, so it really didn't get us closer to funding. The original outcome that I just shared with you was the essentially the 5th version of the grant, and then this final version that ended up at the 3rd percentile. So this took a long time and a lot of back and forth. And I know a couple of colleagues who participated in this are on the call today, and I so they know as well. This was really a tremendous amount of work to try to get it to the point where we could get it funded and do the science. So with that, I'm just going to summarize a few additional points, and this is my last slide. So it's really important to moderate the tone of your introduction. Don't write the rebuttal when you're angry, because you'll just want to flame, basically. The alternative is to write that angry rebuttal and then delete it. Don't ever submit it, just so that you get that out of your system. It's really important to seek input from your colleagues and mentors and really try to figure out what is the reviewer getting at before you revise. And be realistic about the resubmission versus submitting a new grant. Obviously, every time you start again, you have 2 chances to get that particular proposal funded. So the original grant and the revised grant. And again, this is obviously specific to NIH grants, but you should be realistic about that. If the grant has been unscored, it's very, very difficult to then, on the revised grant, get it into the fundable range. It's not impossible, but it is very difficult. And so you may want to give yourself that chance of starting a new grant and then taking the feedback. Obviously, you can incorporate all of the feedback that you're getting for every version of the grant that you submit. You should try to respond to as many of the critiques and comments as you can. And as I pointed out in our 4-year odyssey of getting our R01 funded, even if you are highly responsive to all the criticisms that the reviewers raise, your score may not improve and your percentile may not improve, which is really the key issue. And then lastly, don't lose hope. Everybody that you encounter who has written a grant has experienced a rejection. And I will say I've been doing this long enough now that it doesn't get less painful when you get bad news on a grant, but you just have a few more resources in order to deal with that. And you know that hopefully you'll be able to get it into the fundable range with some additional work. So I'm going to stop there and can take any remaining questions if there are any.